This is the foundation. Stories from people who build things, products, services, businesses, how they started, what they're doing now, and where they're going.
Good afternoon on this Tuesday, sunny day for us here on the West Coast. Hopefully, you've got a good day too.
We're lucky. We're just about, I don't know, a month and a half away from people starting to complain. We pivot from complaining about the heat to complaining about the cold almost overnight. And so we wish it was not so hot. And then the second it's not so hot, we complain about it being cold. So
That's true. If that's the worst of our problems right now,
yeah.
I guess we've got an opportunity to
Yeah,
complain.
we say it's our God-given right as Midwesterners to complain about the weather regardless of what it's giving us.
Great, great. Well, let me jump in with some of the questions that I have that sort of spur this dialogue.
Sure.
As I mentioned, thank you for taking the time. And as is the name of this conversation, let me ask you my first question, which is, what is the foundation of Kinexx?
Kinexx is I'll sort of walk you into it by telling you what the catalyst for starting Kinexx was, and then I'll talk specifically about how we answered that with the business. The affordable housing gap in this country is ever growing, and it's not a story that most people are familiar with, and it's an issue that most people are very kind of in tune with, but yet there haven't been any viable solutions to it to really slowing that down or sort of reversing that trend, in spite of a lot of really, really well-intentioned groups and incredibly intelligent people really devoting large portions of their lives and careers to it. And so in Chicago, that problem is the same as everywhere. It's, I think, the last information that was released, it's probably a little dated. It was somewhere in the range of like 150,000 units short, housing units. I was an architect. My former partner was a general contractor and real estate professional by trade. And so we really started with a lot of conversations, kind of the why nots and what ifs. There's this mounting affordable housing gap. And it's not just sort of low income, it's also workforce. And it's this really, really big problem across the country. But in Chicago, it was, why with all of these smart people that we deal with all the time in the construction world, in the engineering world, in the design world, why has nobody cracked this code? And we realized that as much as we had existed and really appreciated our lives in the conventional construction world, there were these natural thresholds to this, what some would argue is like an antiquated industry. It hasn't progressed technologically nearly on the same curve as a lot of other industries. And it's remained very much the same for about 200 years, as you know. And so that's not to discredit. There's a lot of invention in that industry. And so I came up in conventional construction. I don't like to throw stones, but there are natural limitations. You can only squeeze so much out of cost out of a material. You can only find so much efficiency in labor forces. And so with these natural ceilings, we realized that instead of kind of beating our heads against the wall and trying to play within the rules of this existing game, what if there was another game? What if there was a whole nother game that had a whole nother set of rules that enabled us to kind of transcend some of those limits and constraints? And for us, that became manufacturing, and specifically off-site manufacturing. And we understood it's not a magic bullet for everything. It's a really, really powerful tool and platform to address anything that is very kind of repetitive in nature. Housing became one. There are a lot of examples of that. Obviously, there's hospitals and hotels, but housing really became our focus for that. So there's this huge problem, and there's this new kind of methodology to address it in a meaningful way. And we thought those two paired quite well with taking a real stab at least getting at a formula to address the affordable housing gap in a meaningful way.
So you were sort of marrying the concept of modular housing within the construct of affordable housing too. And maybe that's a space that isn't necessarily filled yet very much.
Yeah, I think we're getting there. It's like, as is the case with a lot of with a lot of cultural trends, I think the US tends to be a little slow to the game, unfortunately. Modular is becoming a very predominant methodology in Europe and South America and Asia. It just hasn't quite taken hold. It still represents a very small component of construction that happens in our country. But in my former life, I had a small architecture practice in Chicago. We designed we really enjoy the intellectual exercises of kind of every project was a one-off, as is usually the case. And so we
Right.
would spend hundreds of hours of collectively of our time solving a problem, and we would learn from it, but that problem would sort of live and die with that project. And I think the reason that modular it became a really refreshing pivot was because especially for housing, is that even though housing is diverse and there's lots of different, needs and unit types and constituencies and demographics and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that there were certain components that were repetitive. A kitchen, a bathroom, there's certain elements, the kind of the building blocks of a home across all of those unit types. There are lots of similarities. And so when you solve a problem for something, that solution rather iterates over.
Sure.
And so you get all this mileage out of those hours you put in. And for me, that was really satisfying because it's this state of continuous improvement, and we're developing this really robust kit of parts that we can leverage in different ways to build a whole lot of different housing types and kind of the approach missing middle kind of formats, emergency relief formats, multifamily, and a lot of different markets. But it's really all the same conversation when you break it down to this sort of unitized. You find the lowest common denominator of form and space and function, and you allow that to become interchangeable across different project types.
Does that also mean financially some economies of scale in regards to everything that you're purchasing, using, and deploying in your houses?
It is. I mean, I think we haven't hit where I think there's another gear that we're really eager to hit as far as buying power, but we've enjoyed some of that. And so modular in general, not just our company, thrives. The more kind of volume and the faster the more stuff the pipeline is, and the more kind of high volume you're able to achieve as a company, it equates to increased buying power. Your unit costs for all of those materials go down because you're buying in large quantities. You're not buying at the scale of a home. You're buying at the scale of 100 homes. And you're striking deals over time for the more economical material costs. I think the big pivot for us, and it was this really funny, I'm not jumping off of the topic. I'll just give you a little anecdote.
Oh, no, that's fine.
We started and we thought, well, we know design and we know construction, and so this is easy. It was just construction indoors. So the construction indoors philosophy made it very comfortable for us when we started. But as we started moving and pushing for more efficiency and how do we produce faster while maintaining quality, we realized after about a year and a half, like this moment of self-realization, like, oh my gosh, we're not a construction company at all. We're a manufacturing company, and not a single soul in the building had manufacturing experience. And I mean, it sounds really silly in retrospect, but it was just you go with what you know.
Right.
And what was interesting about that realization was the conversations kind of changed. So it used to always be when I would deal with like evaluate bids as an architect, most of it was how do we get the materials, find more effective uses of materials or bring the material cost down. And that was our primary lever. And for us, the conversation has changed to speed. And so how do we move things through more efficiently? Every second that a person spends should be really efficient. And so the person carrying on a typical job site, carrying a 4x8 sheet of drywall up 3 stories to put it next to a wall, and they go down and get the other one and they grab it. The movement of the people and sort of their time in any given workday, if you can optimize that, the speed of how you're pushing things through coupled with that efficiency of labor, that's really where the big savings come. We talked about buying power with materials. The labor we found is actually equally, if not more of a bonus in this platform as compared to stick built, because you're bringing the object that you're building, you're bringing it to the people, and you're bringing it to the materials and bringing it to the tools. And so you're not resetting up every day. Your people show up, it's all there. The product comes, they install the panel. It moves on. So it's this really cool, I guess, reordering of priorities that has it's been a learning curve, but it's been really fun to walk down that path.
Good. Thank you. Now, I want to ask you a little bit about aesthetics and design as an architect yourself. And of course, what we know from a production home standpoint over the last 20 plus years is there's a desire for different elevations, whereas before, the housing tracks were just flipping floor plans, basically. So how do you address the aesthetic component of your elevation?
Yeah, I think I'll give a quick intro to that. I think my previous company was called Ellipsis. And the reason that
Mm-hmm.
the name of that company, that design firm, was all based on this idea that design doesn't have to stop the moment a building is constructed. That design can, instead of ending in a period, can end in this ellipsis, and it invites kind of invention, and it really becomes a complete design when someone pours their entire life into that space, right? And so
Yes.
it's sort of a humble attitude about, the design role as a designer. And so you give this
Mm-hmm.
really productive and thoughtful lead off, that's sort of highly precise and beautiful, but it really doesn't become complete until people kind of fill it with their lives.
Right.
And with modular, I think that's a similar attitude. There is, in a different way though, because there is this, there's this attitude that we have that we want to provide this really beautiful and flexible and agile armature that can be kind of adjusted in as many different ways as possible. And so with the same building and same set of floor plans, let's say, you could have 20 on a block, and one could look very traditional, one could be a transitional sort of home, one can be uber contemporary, different window patterns, different material palettes. And so some of that I guess that design authorship is based on restraint, more so than it's based on kind of dictating the terms of that. So we have our own design,
Right.
kind of base designs for elevations and different roof lines, and a lot of different kind of ways that we provide or suggest that variety. But it's more suggestive, and we've had a lot of those built, but we've also had a lot where we become almost the kind of sounding board for other people's creativity.
Right.
And so it's more about setting up the system it's sort of like urban planning. Urban planners don't tell you what store has to go on the corner, but they tell you that a store has to go on the corner. So they set up an infrastructure within which other people can leverage their own creativity, as the project moves forward. And that's kind of how we treat it.
Well, and you intimated earlier about kit of parts, which I've heard before, which leads you to believe that they're interchangeable and can be configured in various ways and formats, aesthetically as well as functionally.
Yeah, that's right. I think one thing that we do a little differently, and it's become, we think, a pretty powerful differentiator, is most modular companies, for very good reason, their boxes are as big as they make them as large as they possibly can, within the limits of transport constraints, basically. And so
Mm-hmm.
they'll be 16 feet wide by 40 feet. And so it's a whole floor plate, even if it's a level building. We're a little different because we started to address kind of urban infill situations. And then so the byproduct of that, and we think it's a very productive byproduct, is that our modules are much smaller. And so they're very programmatically kind of deterministic, meaning that it's a very isolated function. So it's an interior bedroom module, or a kind of end conditioned bedroom module, a 2-bath module, a 1-bath module, a kitchen. So, and there's not just one of each, there's lots of varieties of all of what I just said, but it enables us to take similar modules or the same kind of building block and use it in a small 1-bedroom, 1-bath ranch, but use that same module in a multifamily apartment building or a townhome, and so they're interchangeable, and there's a ton of variety within that. But when you reduce it down to that kind of that very isolated building block, you can get a lot of mileage out of it across lots of different unit types or unit designs.
Who's your customer?
We're mostly B2B. We're just starting our kind of first dip of the toe in the water with B2C kind of work. It is, as I mentioned, I think we thrive and we're able to be most productive for clients when we're doing things in larger volume. And so the kind
Okay.
of the one-off, tailored kind of solutions, we can tailor our product and customize like anybody can, but we're much more efficient when we can work for developers predominantly. And so the lion's share of who we've kind of who we partnered with in the past have been for-profit developers, emerging developers, and nonprofit developers.
Okay.
The nonprofit developers are wonderful because they're very kind of mission aligned with us. We found there's the sort of the schedule urgency and the time urgency doesn't always align with the cadence of how fast we manufacture. And so there's different ways that we adjust to work with different clients. And so we found that when we work with for-profit developers that are kind of more market rate, which has been a lesser percentage of our work thus far,
Mm-hmm.
they're very kind of, they've done this many times. They're very conscious of what is one of our primary value propositions, which is speed. We can go very, very fast in high volume. And so they understand that that's something that they can leverage for their own benefit. And so they're sort of
Mm-hmm.
on it. And the money moves when it should move, and the building gets built, and we get deliveries out, and it sort of makes our machine a little more, well oiled. It's just depending on whom we're serving, we just have to kind of tailor our scope of services to add a little bit more kind of management assistance or administrative assistance for some, and not as much for others.
When we spoke earlier, you mentioned that you manufacture in Illinois. What, in the Chicago area?
Yeah, so we based ourselves in Chicago. One, we were both living there at the time. I'm not living there anymore. You mentioned I'm in Ohio now, but I spent a lot of time still in Chicago. The real reason, though, was from the start, we had a lot of ambition to expand first to the Midwest and then nationally. The two components of Chicago were really attractive to us. It was the fact that it represented collectively kind of one of the tightest sets of constraints that we could imagine, kind of at least within our reach. One was the building codes. Chicago has the second strictest building codes next to New York, and they're very close second. And it's very subjective, I know, but it's much harder to build in Chicago than it is in most places in the country. And you couple that with tight urban streets and urban infill conditions, where you have a lot of these underserved neighborhoods that have really rich traditions, but they have a lot of missing teeth in the sort of fabric of block. And there's two existing buildings. And so we need to find a way to basically design a product that can be realistically delivered between 2-3-story or 2-story buildings on, a 25-foot wide lot. And so that forces us to be really, really nimble, and really it forces the size of our modules, and it forces the construction of it from a code perspective. All of our electrical is in conduit, and we have all copper plumbing, and it's sort of some of the things that are looser elsewhere, are not nearly as loose in Chicago. Instead of seeing that as a burden for ourselves, we see it as a real opportunity with the understanding, like, if we can figure out the formula to do it in Chicago, then doing it elsewhere is going to be a much easier lift. And I say that with the understanding that there's some exceptions to that, like California with earthquake resistance and hurricane force winds in Florida and things like that. But for the most part, that we think that holds up. And so when we deal with municipalities who think modular is like this, totally foreign concept, we have these conversations with economic development groups and, mayor's offices. And it really helps kind of say that, listen, we're not building to lower codes. We're actually exceeding the strictest codes in the country. And so it eases people's kind of mindsets and immediately wipes away any stigmas they have about the word modular. When they hear it, they think of, it evokes a different sort of image and sort of understanding of quality in different people's minds.
Well, those municipalities probably not only want to address the affordable issue, but also the density issue too. Obviously, in California, we've got legislation now that is going to force cities to build more dense housing. So you've got the opportunity to address both those scenarios.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Chicago is actually only a couple of weeks away from passing an ADU ordinance, which I know is, it's very, that's a common phrase on the West Coast, and it's, it's making its way in from the coastlines. But and a lot of cities have accomplished that very, very successfully. I think I know Portland has seen a lot of ADU activity, but it's all this idea, like, how do you add density in an existing neighborhood fabric or city fabric without, defaulting to just these massive 120 unit multifamilies on the corners of blocks and sort of disrupting the fabric and these missing middle strategies. It's sort of this overlay of these acupuncture kind of addition of density. But Chicago's right on the edge of passing that. They ran a pilot program, and we're sort of eagerly waiting because it's not a high volume of built work for us because they're so small, but it's this great opportunity to participate in what we feel is a very productive strategy for adding density within the neighborhoods.
Good. Well, continued luck with that. I wanted to ask you your manufacturing process, and you intimated a little bit about the foundational, no pun intended, aspects and the conduits and everything that goes underneath the house.
Sure.
I don't know if you're building subterranean or basements. I know Midwest has lots of basements.
Yeah.
But give me an idea of how you start that process, what you put the modular homes on, and how quickly you're able to build a house in a day.
Yeah. But we have, so our foundations are very, very simple. We just do frost depth foundations. And so in the Midwest
Mm.
with the freezes, it's, you have to go down to a certain depth. So for us, it's regional. For us, it's 42 inches down, very simple strip footings and foundation walls. We set on top. And so we are not, we can do basements. For us, we're sort of agnostic to what happens below where we set, as long as we're set on level
Right.
foundation walls. And so whether that's a 9 foot deep foundation for a basement, we don't coordinate a lot of custom build outs of those basements, but we can certainly service that. And most of our designs are adaptable to be able to drop a stair down to a basement. But our standard is just a typical strip footing and foundation wall. In Chicago, it's pretty common. We do a little mud slab on top, not for structurally, but it's strictly for rodent control, which grosses many people.
Uh-huh.
But if you don't, it's you have a lot of visitors to your home. So that's not a requirement elsewhere, but we do that as a standard practice. And then above that, we just set our modules. Our modules are free span, and so they're the standard in Chicago is 19 feet wide, and that kind of maxes out what you can build within the zoning of a typical lot. You can go a little bit bigger, but going bigger triggers a bunch of fire rating requirements. And so it's our most economical kind of max out of that. So they're all free span, which means that when we build them, most interior walls are non-structural, and with the exception of a couple of shear walls, so they can be adjusted kind of very, very, in many ways. I haven't heard of any that we've done yet that anybody's done that to, but if, 15, 20 years down the road, if they wanted to repartition or change the floor plates, it's quite easy to do that. So did that answer your question about foundations?
Well, the foundation, yes. So let's go up from there. Again, I don't know, I think a couple stories, but tell me what the process is in the manufacturing capacity.
Yeah. So
How is a modular home built?
it's built in volumetric boxes. So if you imagine a kind of we from here forward, I will say assembly line, and I'm going to put it in air quotes because it's not what people imagine is a sort of automated 6-axis robot. It's very kind of human and analog, but it is an assembly line in the sense that I mentioned earlier, that the product comes to the people and the tools and the materials. But if you imagine a kind of a line in which raw materials are on one end and sort of nearly finished product or delivery ready products are come out the other end as a box. We sort of, that's the kind of the progression. And so it starts with, we're all steel. So we're all cold formed steel, members. And those are CNC fabricated for us. So they're custom rolled to our lengths and with punches where we need them. And so that's a really cool digital process that again goes back to taking minutes out of each process of making a panel. And because it's more snapped together, there's not a lot of cutting, there's not a lot of measuring, and there's jigs involved that kind of take pre-cut pieces and make sure they're in the right spot and they're fastened. But they go from sort of like raw material to panels and subcomponents. Those panels are erected into boxes. We have a proprietary 3-dimensional jig that we use that makes everything stand up and kind of offset correctly, so the ceilings are in the right place and the floors, and they're all plumb and level. And then they shuttle over to our production line, and value starts to be added as it goes from there. And so interior walls are added, electrical rough-in is then done, and mechanical plumbing rough-in. And then about that moment on our line, it becomes kind of simultaneous work. So it's interior work continues, but then exterior layers start to be added at the same time. It's really nice because you can be working on what will be a 3rd-story module, but you're installing exterior panels and exterior insulation, for example. You're on a step stool as opposed to a scaffold, a 30-foot scaffold that you're hanging over, which is quite nice for a whole lot of reasons, cost, but also, safety and security and just
safety.
Safety is a big one. And so as it goes down, then it takes on, in certain cases, if we're building to a kind of more of a turnkey trim level, like where we wear all the hats and we're delivering a move-in ready product, we would start to install interior doors and cabinets and countertops and put tile in. We don't do any finish trim plumbing or electrical in the shop. We do that in the field, but it's basically developed all the way through until, most of the drywall in that case is mudded and taped and mudded and sanded, and we send it out primed, tiles in, usually no grout. We sort of hedge our bets on that one. We do the grouting in the field.
Okay. Sure,
And
that makes
so, yeah,
sense.
so the idea then is that we deliver it, we sort of load up, we have a storage rail where if it's an 8-module home, for example, all 8 of those need to be completed and delivery ready before it can go out the door. And so,
So 8 module meaning 8 separate homes.
no, so homes are made up of
Oh,
a collection of modules, right? So this is where we
sure.
differ from
Okay.
other modular manufacturers. A lot of them will be, one module for the ground floor, one module for the second floor. For us, in a lot of
Okay.
cases, it could be 4 modules for the ground floor and 4 for the top. And they assemble like Lego blocks, kind of on one atop the other.
Okay.
And so in like a typical, let's call it a 1,600 square foot home, 1,650, would be an 8-module home. And those are different sizes for different reasons. But those get delivered, those go out the door. Once we have all 8 ready, it usually takes about, assuming that obviously the site is prepped simultaneous, the site is kind of built out with excavation and foundation before we get there. And so that's happening in
Mhm.
parallel to our fabrication of the vertical part of the building. And
Mhm.
so that's ready. We're ready. It gets sent out the door, and it usually takes about probably max 5 hours to deliver it, crane it in, erect it, button it up. And so by the end of that delivery day, or 2/3 of the way through that day, it's weather tight, it's secure, it has all of its windows in and they're already flashed. And so it's weather tight, and it's from a safety perspective, it's all kind of locked up, ready to receive final finishes in the field, whatever we haven't done.
That is rapid, it sounds like.
Yeah. It's a quick process. That home that I just described takes, once they start pouring off the line, more than one of those homes comes off per week. So we're at a comfortable pace. We're at like 12 modules per week that get fabricated. So that's, 1.5 homes per week. Sometimes we can get up to 2. So those come off the line, and sort of, so if you were doing 10 homes, it would take about 2 weeks for that from raw material to the first module coming off the line. It would take about 2 weeks for that first one, but then every week after that, at least one home is coming off. So 2 weeks plus another 9 weeks, in 11 weeks, you have 11 homes or 10 homes rather on a job site.
Congratulations. Now, I can imagine in some office somewhere, Chicago or yours, as many companies who begin, they've got the dollar that was their first dollar framed on the wall. You have a picture of the first house that you ever built. And I'm not sure what year that is, but how many since that year have you built and sold?
So I think we're on number 77. So it's been a slow burn. We did one. So we started in 2020. Everybody.
Oh, good timing.
Yeah. Well, I was just about to make the joke. I have a former good friend of mine we both co-taught some graduate classes for about a decade together. And he knows that I started my previous architecture practice in 2008, just as the economy was tanking. And then we decided to start this company 2020, literally a month before COVID shut the world down. And so, yeah, timing is not my strong suit. But we've been very lucky that it kind of progressed through both of those, and in both of those cases. But in 2020, we got a commission from a nonprofit development partner to do our first full-size prototype. And so we did one home, and it was this really over-designed, over-engineered, kind of massive, like robust set of modules to make a home. It was great. It was still one of our favorites, just because there's a lot of nostalgia to, us being able to really do it. But the whole thing was
Sure.
like a full scale. It was a home for somebody, but it was also a full scale research project for us to understand kind of what was and what was not going to be our process. So we did one in 2020. We did 2 in 2021. I think we did 20 some odd, and then the next year, and then it sort of slowly progressed beyond that. But there's been moments of a strategic sort of recoil, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Okay. Good word.
We've had these really interesting moments where we've progressed really quickly. We've like I said, we've sped things up. We've really kind of, we beta tested our process, and we've sort of slowly started to make changes. We converted to this manufacturing mentality, but we've learned a lot of lessons, and sometimes it's taken a lot of iteration to get to points where we said, okay, now we need to take a pause. We need to talk about how we automate certain moments, how we, in very strategic ways to get the most mileage out of certain capital expenditure dollars that we spend, so that we can really kind of pinpoint different bottlenecks in our process, eliminate them. And that doesn't mean necessarily always the manufacturing process. It's also the design and coordination and our procurement and all of these kind of moving parts. But it's been this wild ride. Like the learning curve has been really cool. I always said the one cool thing about architecture was that the architecture profession is that you never know everything. There's always, you're always playing catch up, and there's so much out there to learn, and that learning curve is always quite steep. And I would say this is a different version of that, but it was
Right.
also so foreign to me with my background, manufacturing. I grew up outside of Detroit, so I guess I was on the periphery of that. My father worked for the
Sure.
industry, but he wasn't, I wasn't in the trenches of that world at all before this. And so it's been a cool fish out of
Well,
experience.
I think it's an education and it's learning every moment of the day
Mhm.
as you professionally proceed. And I want to be respectful for your time, as we mentioned, and say to you that it's a fascinating story. I wish you nothing but success. And as we finalize this conversation, I want to ask you, what would be a good question that I should have asked you, and or what would you like to say in closing?
Boy, I think in my conversations with a lot of entrepreneurs, I think some of the questions about failure are often even more interesting than success, because there's a lot, it's like professional athletes say, you never lose. You either win or you learn. And the learning part comes from losing, right? But if you can think of it as a loss, or you can think of it or as a failure, but if you treat it as a really rich opportunity for learning, I think a lot of people have great stories like that. I think for us, it was this inability to understand the relationship, this animal that you create this overhead and this factory and this, like, all these things that you're not familiar with as an architect or a construction professional. You create this rapid fire system, but it's this animal, but what we neglected to understand is you need to really feed that animal. It's like, if you're speeding it up and all of your value proposition is based on speed and volume, you need to have a full scale sales force and marketing force out there, really kind of bringing in jobs and getting in front of people. One, we never had the bandwidth to do that. And so it was also kind of foreign to us. I think a lot of our previous work as construction professionals and architects was really about reputation and about one project would lead to another, and you'd build these relationships and referral networks. We neglected to realize that this is a kind of a high volume. It's almost like a sales game, which sounds very artificial, but
Right.
you only know what you know. And so you learn some of these really hard lessons. I think we bootstrapped our company, which was a really fun story to tell when we started. We started with very little, and we were able to build something, and it always sounds really cool and it resonates, in conversations. But
Sure.
I think looking back, the failure of not raising capital and not kind of getting ourselves in a position where we didn't have to acquire debt in order to kind of build and grow. I wasn't a business school guy. Neither was my partner. And so it was, there were some hard lessons that we're finally we've overcome. And those are the learning those are great lessons for us. And, we won't make those mistakes again, but those are quite cool. I also think that you asked, so I know I'm rambling on. You asked what
No, fine.
question should you have asked? I think some of it is just kind of the sort of busting through some doors. I think, like, how do you, I always ask this to other people in the modular world. It's actually a very kind of small world where I think people are really supportive of each other.
Interesting.
And so, but I always ask
Sure.
them kind of, what do you do? What are your methods for sort of knocking down some of the doors of skepticism and hurdles? And because it's this new thing, it doesn't fit neatly into existing buckets for financing, and it doesn't neatly fit into code review buckets that most cities have. And so
And scale, the paradox of scale.
that's right. Yeah. I think those are always really interesting stories. Remember when we brought on some investors, one of the questions somebody asked, and it was a really good question, was, what's to stop another big existing kind of more robust modular manufacturing company to come in and just to Chicago and just squeeze you out? We were the only ones doing modular. We were the first company to build modular homes at scale in the city, but we weren't big and we weren't
Oh, that's
robust.
good.
And so it was a good question. What stops once the door is open and there's evidence of that being feasible in Chicago? What's to stop a bigger company from coming in? And my answer to that was they could come in and they could go through the 5-year learning curve of figuring out how to navigate the city of Chicago and the building department And all of these really kind of, it's this very circuitous, that's no discredit to them. They're fantastic and they've been great kind of supporters of us, but it is
Right.
understanding how to navigate a kind of very obscure process and kind of work through some of these obstacles in a meaningful way. They could do all that. We're not rocket scientists. We figured it out, and it took us a long time. And so most of I'd like to say as an architect that our whole value is in our product and our kind of system that we've developed. There's a lot of value in that, but I think of equal value is just solving the formula of how the hell do we do this in Chicago. And so my answer to that person was they could do that and they could spend all that time, but the easier sort of route for them would just be to try to buy us. It's like they're like, why?
Right.
And so, of course, I don't have a crystal ball. That might have been naive, but I still believe that very strongly. It's this really tough, it's been this really interesting but difficult process to basically walk into rooms with people and say, we're doing this thing. It's not what you think it is. I promise. Trust us, but here's the value. Here's why it helps, the city's affordable housing needs. Here's why it is a better way to build. Affordable doesn't mean ugly. Modular doesn't mean ugly. Modular doesn't mean low quality. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. It's better quality.
Yes, it is.
So, but a lot of people in certain seats, they have ways of looking at things that it's comfortable to keep their arms around that. And so there's new technology or new kind of way of doing things. I think there's a natural resistance to it. And so those stories from other people, I'm always really interested. How did they get through their, version of what we went through?
Well, we hear so much about the word disruptive from that standpoint, and it's how do you remain politely and gently disruptive in that standpoint so that people can follow along.
Well, and that's I used the word restraint earlier. That's one of those, and I'm sure you've dealt with this, and you're inserting yourself as a designer into neighborhoods or contexts that are not, local to you, requires a bit of sensitivity and a little bit of, there's a trust building kind of process that is required, especially in community building projects. And so the restraint part for us, and in particular for the design, myself and the other designers, is that we don't want to be sort of top down in our design process. We want to actually leave open our system. So I think some of the value of our system is that we've worked really hard to make it as flexible as possible, so that if you place it in an old, blue collar neighborhood of Chicago where that really is like everything is brick and everything, and if that's really important to the neighborhood, I find variety great. Like I'm always the one saying, well, it doesn't have to be, we don't have to match, but a lot of neighborhood groups and a lot of municipalities, it's just mandatory. And so rather than saying like, sorry, we can't serve you, we say, sure, like our product can be that, but also 2 blocks away, it can be a super contemporary, very modern home. And it doesn't change anything that we do. We actually are still like our manufacturing process is the same, whether we're sort of tailoring it to A or B. And that I think is where I guess you get older and you're proud of, you find prideful moments in your own ability to kind of set your own ego. And I think that's one of them for me and for our team.
Fantastic. Well, if I brought my own hard hat because we're coming to Chicago at the end of October, would I be able to have a tour?
Sure. Yeah, of course. Yeah, we love hosting.
Good.
Well, it's fun. After all these homes that we've delivered, we have a lot more to do. It's a lot for us, but we know that it's not much compared to most other companies. But we've done enough where the shine should have worn off for me by now. It's like seeing these things go rolling down our line, or seeing these modules hoisted in the air and set. It's like I'm still like a kind of a nerdy kid watching it, and I get really excited.
Sure.
It hasn't worn off for me, and so I always like sharing that with other people, like seeing how the sausage is made, especially to people in the design and construction world. It's really cool, just because it's just interesting. I think it's an interesting way to look at things. It triggers a lot of other people's creativity, and so yeah. Short answer, yes, we'd love to have you. Yeah, thanks so much for the great questions. It's been a fun chat.
It has been. Thank you.
Have a great day.
The Foundation is produced by Studio Conover and edited by Brett Euler. Studio Conover is a strategic marketing design firm for manufacturers of building products. Visit studioconover.com for more information.